Afternoon, Ben. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you, Matt. Wet.
Good. Wet. Yeah, miserable here too.
Yeah.
Thanks for sending these slides through. I think I'll just share the screen, share those slides, and you can talk us through what you've seen over the last few weeks.
Very good.
So, I want to share screen, and I'll put that on.
Yes,
full
this
screen.
is an update from the PM room of what was coming through my desk at the moment. We better start, I suppose, with the news that Bluetongue has arrived in the UK, on the UK shores in Kent, in a cow, I gather. So it was probably always going to happen, but we all have to be extra vigilant with any signs that could be, caused by Bluetongue. We should have it in the back of our minds, perhaps especially those of us in the south of England and on the east coast. But back to endemic diseases, which is what pays the mortgage. We are well and truly in sheep reinfection with worms season, because it's still not that cold, very wet, grass is growing, lots of lambs still outside, continually reinfected with worms. And the commonest thing I'm seeing at the moment is people who say, I've got lambs outside that aren't doing, I've wormed them, but they're still not doing. And I say, when did you worm them? And they say, oh, about 6 weeks ago with a white drench. And you say, well, it's probably still worms, and this is surprising. At the moment, probably the species of worms that are busy are the ones in the small intestine, the trichostrongyles, generally speaking, and those are the ones that keep getting reinfected and reinfected and reinfected. And those are the ones where the persistent wormers, moxidectin, are not as persistent against compared to the abomasal ones. So on the next slide, I think we ought to consider not just what the lambs are doing, but what the worms are doing, what the worm eggs are doing. And at the moment, the worm eggs are thinking, this is a good time to hatch. If I'm a worm egg, once I've hatched, I've got about 10 days before I'm eaten, before I die. And at the moment, though that 10 days is going to be all of 10 days because the conditions are good. You know, it's not that cold. It's nice and wet, humid. And the chances are I'm going to successfully be eaten if I hatch out now. So that's what they're doing. So I could if I hatch out and die, the pasture becomes clean. If I hatch out and get eaten, I can eventually produce another 1,000 eggs and make everything worse. So vigilance is required and continuous monitoring of these lambs. Probably the best solution is to house them or sell them as stores or put them on some clean grazing like a herbal lay or something like that. But you want to constantly monitor worm egg counts and constantly measure growth rates at the moment in your fat lambs, because the worm challenge is very high. The reinfection worm challenge is very high. And obviously goes without saying that if the worm challenge is high, then it's even more important to make sure that your group 1, group 2, group 3 wormers are working by doing a fecal egg count reduction test after you've used them. So that's the fat lambs, which it's a battle to keep them growing, especially if they're outside. And the next, and this is what they look like when they have worms. Easy to diagnose, just scoured out and not growing. The next thing we probably ought to consider is your gimmer replacements, especially the runners that aren't getting mated this year. It is worth giving some consideration to what you are selecting for your future female lines, and it might be worth measuring their growth rate in the face of what is probably quite a significant worm challenge at the moment, in conjunction with measuring growth worm egg counts to quantify the level of challenge. If this does nothing else, it should make you think, I need to put individual tags in those animals. And if you're gathering them for any reason, you might as well measure them with your EID, because it will give you more information, and information is key. So if you haven't got tags in their ears and if you don't know their growth rates, you know nothing. So if you don't do anything else, I would consider putting EID tags in those, and as often as you can, although it's a pain, measure their growth rates and measure their fecal egg counts, I would. And don't forget about them, because throughout the winter and throughout the early spring, although they should be gaining immunity to worms, it's can't be completely relied upon, and you need to keep monitoring them. So don't forget about those important determinants of your future success as a sheep farmer. And once you have that information, you can decide which individuals to breed to which tups and which to breed to other tups, because you want to select for sheep that are going to thrive in the face of a worm burden. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. Next one.
So then so that's worms. The other big one is fluke. They say that the serological monitoring for fluke has shown reasonably low numbers of serological positives so far, but it's still not got cold enough, I don't think, for the snails to have packed in for the year, and they probably are still busy. And the other day I saw a bull out in a field which had died of something else. He had bad teeth and died of listeria, but this was his liver. You can see these fluke. You can see those fibrosed bile ducts, and you can see those adult fluke there in that liver, and that just reminds us that fluke in cattle laying eggs are a reservoir throughout the season in sheep and cattle farms, and those eggs will go and infect snails, and those snails will go and lay metacercaria, which will infect sheep, and so the snails have a chance all the way through the year to be infected with fluke. So it still could happen. There could still be some, next slide, acute fluke in sheep, and there could still be some chronic fluke later on in the year, because it still hasn't really got cold enough to stop all that stuff from progressing. And then, of course, as ever, the order of diagnostic sequence is bloods first, then copper antigen, then fluke egg. So at the moment, I think we're still in the sort of serological blood monitoring phase, rather than the, well, copper antigen as well, but bloods first, I would say. So anything that looks fluky or might want treatment with a fluke side, bloods is the thing still at present.
Don't forget about checking any fallen stock, or if you're sending direct to slaughter, look at your kill sheets as well, because that's always a good indicator.
Yes, that's a sensitive indicator of acute fluke starting.
Next.
So that's the sheep. Worms, and then fluke. I have seen a record number of cows with staggers, I would say, this year, confirmed staggers with low aqueous humour magnesium. And as I always say to people, and as people almost never do, the magnesium is one thing. The magnesium is the sort of final coup de grace cause of death. But just as important out on these pastures is the sodium, because the sodium is needed for absorption of magnesium across the rumen wall, and the potassium, because the more potassium you have, the more difficult it is for magnesium to be absorbed. I think there's plenty of grass about, because it's been still warm and wet. The grass is long, the grass is lush, there's plenty of it, and it's conditions where potassium may be high, sodium may be low, and therefore magnesium absorption may be moderate. And the odd, stormy, rainy, horrible night means that cattle might not eat, and every single day they need to eat the magnesium that they need every single day, because it isn't stored. So they're losing it all in milk, and I think some of these suckler calves are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and probably sucking more milk than we think. So if they're late weaned, if they're still on their dams, there's a constant leaking sump of magnesium, which every single day needs to be replaced by daily intakes, and often that doesn't happen. And if that doesn't happen even for one day, even for 2 hours, the cow will die of staggers. So, but now is the time to measure herbage for sodium and potassium, so you can correct it for next year, so you don't get staggers this time next year. And obviously weaning will reduce the risk, because the sump stops leaking then, because the milk isn't being lost, or the magnesium isn't being lost in milk. And housing will obviously help, because the biochemical makeup of silage is different from grass, and the risk factors are lower. So staggers very common. And then you get into housing of animals, and I think the difference this year between the wet, lush grass outside and some of the silage, total mixed rations, and even hard feed that cattle are getting inside, is this year going to be quite an abrupt change, because there probably isn't that much stemmy grass, and there probably isn't that much fibre in the grass outside, which means that if they get a bit of hard food, then there isn't that much stop, and it could lead to acidosis quite quickly. And I've seen this when they've come in the last 3 weeks. I've seen liver abscesses in suckler calves coming in, like this one here. That's what this picture is of, liver abscesses. And then next picture is of a cow, a suckler cow, which came in with a great big liver abscess, probably the result of ruminal acidosis because of a abrupt dietary change from grass to probably silage and cake or creep or barley or some such acidifying influence. Then what happens is sometimes these abscesses can eat into the adjacent caudal vena cava, which is one of the major blood vessels, and here you can see a great big abscess in the caudal vena cava. Once these abscesses are in the caudal vena cava, they spread to the lungs, and next photo shows you some abscesses in the lungs. And once these abscesses are in the lungs, they can eat into blood vessels, and then the blood vessels, often pulmonary arteries, they bleed excessively, and you get a lot of massive nosebleed in a beast or a cow, which is the last thing it ever does. You find it in a pool of blood, and a lot of that blood goes into the rumen. So here is this rumen full of blood in the next picture. So you need to give some consideration to the transition of the diet when you're housing suckler cows and calves, to make sure you don't give them too much carbohydrate, starch, cake, creep, barley too soon, and let them transition to the diet as gradually as possible. Then the other thing that can do, still on the subject of dietary change, is there is a syndrome where if you have not much protein in grass outside, but then suddenly lots of protein in feed inside, you can get a spike of protein in the rumen, and you get a fog fever-like syndrome, which takes about a week, 10 days to happen, but that causes direct damage to the lungs in the same way as fog fever does. And I'm sure that does happen with suckler calves post-housing. And sometimes everybody thinks it's infectious diseases like RSV, all that stuff, bacterial pneumonia, whatever. But actually, sometimes the diet can not be helping if the spike in particularly protein is too high, and that can trigger a fog fever-like reaction in the lungs. The other thing that you need to be absolutely certain of is that you've got rid of all the parasites in these calves when you house them. The next slide shows you a bacterial pneumonia in a calf, which was probably triggered by old airway damage caused by lungworm, even if there wasn't clinical signs of overt deaths or massive clinical signs of lungworm. Sometimes the damage to the airways caused by a bit of lungworm migration can be enough to trigger a bacterial pneumonia when they get housed and the ventilation becomes worse. And also sometimes, as we said about sheep, same applies to cattle. The parasitic burden, the worm burden, the gutworm burden in cattle is going to be significant this year, so they need to be wormed at housing to clean out that burden and make sure the immune system is able to concentrate on bacterial infections in the lungs, not gut, not still be concentrating on the burden of worms in the guts. So everything I would say wants to be housed at worming, so that to promote growth rates, because they're obviously not going, the reinfection isn't a problem once they're housed. And then the last thing is just IBR. Anything strong stores that are getting housed need to have an IBR intranasal vaccine, ideally, because IBR will come out being a herpes virus if it gets the opportunity, and you can have some pretty horrible outbreaks. And this is a trachea that's from a beast with IBR, and you can see why, with that amount of damage to the trachea, they don't last very long with IBR. So that's a quick roundup of what's coming through my PM room table at the moment. A little bit of planning ahead and a little bit of low-hanging fruit, I'd say.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ben. I wasn't aware that we'd actually had a positive Bluetongue in the UK. I've been following it on the in Holland, but yeah, was that just this last week? Yeah,
I think it was Saturday they announced it. So they're working at it. So hopefully they'll cap it.
Yeah, definitely want to keep an eye on. And I like the idea of housing everything at worming time, but I think we should definitely worm the young stock at housing. Yep. So that's a good one.
Yes.
All right.
Right.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. And let's catch up again towards the end of the month.
Marvelous. Will do.